It's now my pleasure to present to you Congressman Adam Smith. Congressman Smith has lived his life in the 9th District of Washington State and resides in Tacoma. Now in his 6th term, Smith serves on both the Armed Services Committee and Foreign Affairs Committee. As an 11-year member of the House Armed Services Committee, he chairs the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Unconventional Threats and Capabilities, which oversees the Defense Department's efforts to counter cyber threats, among other critical areas. Given his committee assignment, Smith has unique insights into today's foremost national security issues, including the ongoing conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as our larger efforts to stop the spread of terrorist groups and their violent totalitarian ideology. Smith recently traveled to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the United Kingdom, where he led a congressional delegation focused on counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency activities. In addition to representing the McCord Air Force Base and Fort Lewis, he carries oversight responsibilities on those who formulate our nation's defense and foreign policy and meets regularly with commanders, troops, and diplomats that carry out our missions. Congressman.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction and for the opportunity to be here today to address this very important group. I think it is incredibly important that groups like this get together for many reasons, but one is to highlight how grave the threat is. And as David said in his remarks, and I thought that was an excellent way of looking at it, how the media does not respond unless there is a very, very high body count or something spectacular. But when you think about it, the threats are very real, whether they succeed or not. And unfortunately, we still have a lot of work to do to convince a lot of people threatened by violent extremism that the threat is real and requires a strong, comprehensive response. And there are many ways of thinking about this, but I always think about the fact that Al-Qaeda declared war against the West and the United States in 1996. And it wasn't until after 9/11 that we returned the favor. We are often slow to respond, and it's very important that conferences like this are brought together so that when we get that focus and draw attention to what is a very, very real threat. I will follow up on what the Baroness's approach, focusing on what a comprehensive approach to terrorism would look like and why it is important that we implement one. I'm going to focus on 4 main areas, placing particular emphasis on the last 2 for reasons that will become obvious as I get to them. Of the 4 things we need to do, certainly the 2 that I think we're very much aware of and have heard quite a bit about in this conference is, number 1, you have to confront state sponsors of terror. And I had some things that I wanted to say about that, but Mr. Netanyahu said them far, far better than I could last night, so I won't repeat them. We do need to look at Iran and Syria and other state sponsors of terror and come together as civilized nations to put pressure on them to raise the cost of being state sponsors. That is a very important aspect of confronting the threat of terrorism, particularly here in Israel and in the Middle East. Second, we need to disrupt the networks. This is what we call in the special operations area the direct approach, basically identifying terrorists and taking them out, either capturing them or killing them. And this is very important, and is something that I believe the United States and others have been fairly successful at since 9/11. We have set up a very comprehensive intelligence network and a comprehensive military network to do, again, as they say in the special operations world, to find, fix, and finish. Find the target, fix on it, and take it out. And that is something we have done very effectively, certainly in Iraq, also in Afghanistan, but elsewhere. And doing this is very important to stop terrorist attacks because it disrupts their operations. Even if you don't get all of them, the mere fact that you are out there targeting, the mere fact that 4 terrorists can be driving down the road in a car 1 second and be evaporated the next, makes it much more likely that they're going to have a hard time coordinating. They're going to be scared to go out. They're going to be scared to get on the phone. They're going to be scared to communicate with each other and thereby have a lot tougher time finding the money they need and building the resources and building the coordination necessary to launch an attack. It's an important element of what we do. My committee has jurisdiction over the Special Operations Command. Work very closely with them on this strategy, and I believe it is, by and large, working. It has been successful and must be continued. And I want to emphasize that point because what I'm going to say in the next two areas that we need to emphasize typically is responded to. I did an interview with a reporter, as a matter of fact, who did this exact question just a few minutes before I came up for this panel. And that was, as I talked about the other strategies that are important, the general response was, so you don't think that we should be as aggressive in approaching terrorism? Not at all. I think we need to be very, very aggressive in targeting known terrorists and taking them out and making sure that they cannot plot and plan against us. But what I also believe is that that is not enough. There was a great cartoon during the course of the Iraq War a couple years back that I think captured this. It wasn't entirely fair, but it nonetheless made a good point. And that was, it basically showed that the worst job in Al-Qaeda was being the number 3 position in Al-Qaeda. Because every number 3 kept getting killed, day after day after day after day, and they had this picture of all these number 3s lined up on the wall. Of course, the problem was there was a whole other line of number 3s right next to them. The point is, the kill them all and let God sort them out approach will not work. We cannot win the war against violent extremists by simply waiting for them to become extremists and then hoping that we can kill, capture, or disrupt them before they hit us. We must comprehensively look at how we can stop them from becoming violent extremists in the first place. And this is an area I do not believe we have done a good enough job on at this point, certainly in the United States, but also I think in the broad coalition of partners who are trying to confront the threat of violent extremism. There's a great deal of disagreement about how to approach this in the first place, and in the second place, I think particularly in the U.S., we have not placed enough emphasis on it. And there are two key areas here that we need to focus on. Number one is counterinsurgency/development. I'll explain how I sort of merged those two together in a second. They actually merged the two committees that I serve on in the United States Congress. Counterinsurgency is the classic tactic that we are now engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also in a number of other places. I recently visited the southern Philippines where we are engaged in a counterinsurgency strategy. And the core of this, if you do it right, you don't want to wait until things get to the point that they're at in Iraq and Afghanistan. You work with the local populations to train them so that they can defeat insurgents, but also work with the local population so you make sure that they are provided for. Because a community that feels fairly good about their government, fairly good about the existing structure of government and the support systems, is less likely to join an insurgency. And this was best put to me by a retired Special Forces general who talked about when he was working in Northern Africa back in the early 80s. And he said of all the training he received, of all the highly trained Special Forces guys he had with him, of all the equipment, the single best and most effective tool he had was a dentist, because he was able to provide dental care to the local population. And that got him a great deal of intelligence. They were grateful for it. They saw that these were friendly people, and they were given information, and they were able to be very effective at stopping insurgencies before they started. And that is but one example. Healthcare, digging wells, providing schools, figuring out what a community needs in order to feel safe and secure is the core of counterinsurgency. Now, it is fashionable at academic settings, which I guess this is one, to say that it is wrong to claim that poverty causes terrorism. And I understand that argument, and I actually agree with it up to a point. It is very, very true that most terrorist movements are generated by middle-class and educated people, not by people in poverty. Certainly Osama bin Laden fits that mold, and so do many, many others. But that misses the essential point. There are always people out there, educated to one degree or another, who for whatever reason will generate this ideology that is going to solve all of our problems if we just put them in charge and generate it. The question is, does that ideology take root? Do they have followers? Do they have people who sign up and turn this into something other than just some academic raving on a street corner to an international movement? And that question is answered by whether or not there are recruits out there available, people who feel dispossessed, people who feel like the society as it is currently structured does not include them. So poverty may not cause the terrorist movements, but it absolutely fuels them. And if we fail to understand that, we will fail to win our battle against violent extremism. We need a comprehensive development strategy. And yes, we need to be strategic about it. We need to look at those places in the world where we are most threatened. Certainly right now, Afghanistan and Pakistan are excellent examples. We need certainly to be there, as I mentioned, with the direct action approach, but we also need to be there with the development side. If you haven't read it, there's a great book called 3 Cups of Tea, written by a man named Greg Mortensen, who was a mountain climber and just sort of fell into building schools as part of an NGO in some of the poorest regions of Pakistan, and was able to build a lot of support and counter a lot of insurgency operations by basically providing for the people. We have to do that, and as we move forward, we need to be comprehensive as we look at a development strategy throughout the world to try to discourage people from following the violent extremists who are cropping up and following Al-Qaeda and other groups. And the last piece of this is something called strategic communications, or message. And this is an area where I actually think we are very far behind the enemy. Al-Qaeda spends as much time getting their message out as they do plotting and planning terrorist attacks. They use the internet, they use video, they use communications methods that we would not even imagine. They know their audience, they know their message, and they try to get out there and get people to follow them and hate the West. The core of their message, of course, is that the West wants to destroy Islam. And they look at every opportunity to spread that message, to gain either followers or in some cases just sympathy, support, safe haven, where otherwise they would be turned away, by getting sympathy for their message. And we have been very, very slow to respond to that messaging. We in the United States have, in many cases, lost a PR battle to Osama bin Laden, a violent psychopath who has killed more Muslims than anybody I'm aware of, and yet he still holds sway with much of the Muslim population, whereas we in the West can't get out the door. We need to be comprehensive about this approach. And the best way to describe messaging is a lesson I learned actually in my first political campaign, and that is develop a message and deliver it to the people you are trying to persuade. It is a very simple sentence, but it is incredibly complex depending on the circumstances. Number one, you've got to figure out what the message is. Then you've got to develop and make sure that you're delivering it in an intelligent way. But most important, I think, is finding the audience. What is the audience and where do they get their information? And we are starting to come up with some ideas. And a couple of them that I found most insightful in terms of thinking about the disaffected populations out there that would be most likely to follow the violent extremists of Al-Qaeda and other groups is, one of the things we've done is we've developed a comic book series and a video game. These are things that youth will look at. And you can develop a video game and a comic book that makes a very specific point, other than just the standard sort of superhero stuff. And Al-Qaeda has done it, and we have started to do it as well. That is but one example. But the point is, we need to take all of the resources, or some of the resources that we have at any rate, in the West, amongst the civilized nations that are trying to defeat violent extremism, and deliver a message. Figure out where those people are getting their information and counter what Al-Qaeda is putting out so that we can win the battle of ideas. Because we clearly have better ideas and a better ideology. You can look at what the Taliban have provided, what has happened in Iran, and understand if you're just your average person in this world, you do not wish to be governed by them. They are not terribly capable of governing in a way that is beneficial to the population. We can get that message out. Jordan actually had a great deal of success with this and was able to drive down support and sympathy for Osama bin Laden, primarily following the bombings in 2005, that said this is what Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden is, the random killing of Muslims. This is not someone that you want to follow. And they've effectively messaged, and I think we heard a stat cited earlier about how support for Osama bin Laden has dropped dramatically because of that. And that drop in support translates to winning this battle. Now, I have spent a lot of time with our special operations forces in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in a variety of different people, in a variety of different places, And they are an impressive group of people. And when you see technologically and tactically how we identify a top target within the violent extremist movement and take them out, I'll be perfectly honest with you, it is a very cool and inspirational thing to see. The talent and technology that they bring to bear to do that is amazing. It's great. It will not win this battle against violent extremism.
Because every time you have to use violence, it is, yes, in some ways a positive if you use it correctly, but it is also always a negative because there is a backlash. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it does mean that we should not rely on it as the essential tool to winning this battle. As has been said, I think, at different times throughout this conference, while there are some violent extremists within the Muslim population, the overwhelming majority of the Muslim population is unsympathetic to them. We have an audience that we can work with. We can stop the movement from spreading, but we have got to be effective in the way that we deliver our message, and we've got to think about it. Now, primarily in delivering this message, one of the things that we have to be aware of, it is going to be moderate Muslims and moderate Muslim states and institutions that are best equipped to deliver that message. And this is a battle, actually, that we're having now in the State Department and back in the U.S., and that is the battle over what to call the group that is against us. And a whole bunch of names and ideas, Islamists and jihadists and all kinds of different things. If you link them to the Islamic religion in any way, you empower them. If you call them jihadists, that is the ultimate compliment throughout the Muslim world. And I emphasize this because we've had a pushback in saying, well, if you are not forceful, if you are not direct, and do not call them what they are, then you are cowering from the threat. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But the one thing I do know is you're feeding into their message. You are empowering them, growing their sympathy. And again, in growing their sympathy, you get some members to join them, and you also get sympathy. You get safe havens where you otherwise wouldn't. We have got to be smart about how we deliver this message and how we work with our moderate partners in the Muslim world to stop the spread of violent extremism. The last thing that I want to talk about is just briefly something that I know a lot of folks are concerned about, and that is the transition of our government in the United States. And I think that is actually both a challenge and an opportunity. We will have a new president come January, the first new president since 9/11. The challenge, I think, is to make sure that we have continuity within the government. And I think both campaigns are working to make sure that happens. One of the problems with the modern way most governments are run, and the United States government certainly, is it takes a long time to transition, to appoint new cabinet ministers, new positions, to vet, to do all of that. We need continuity. I'm working very closely with Senator Obama's campaign. I'm confident that Senator McCain's campaign is doing the same to make sure that we have that continuity and we don't have a gap in our fight against violent extremism. But the second point is I think there is an opportunity in having a new administration, and that is a lot has happened since 9/11. Some of it good, some of it bad. We have had many disagreements amongst our allies. This is an opportunity to try to bring back together comprehensively all of the forces that have a stake in defeating violent extremism. They are many, they have vast resources, they can be better coordinated than they are right now, more on the same page about the approach that we need to take in combating violent extremism. And I think that this is an opportunity to do that when we get a new administration, regardless of which person it is who wins. And I'll be working hard to make sure that happens as well. So just to conclude, it is important that we look at all elements of this, that we do not simply look at the direct action piece. It is necessary, it must continue, but if we are ultimately to defeat violent extremism, or at least to bring it down to manageable levels, we have got to also look at the development counterinsurgency piece and to constantly battle on the messaging side, to understand that this is at its core a battle of ideas, a battle of ideologies. We have the better ideas, we have the better ideology, but trust me, I've watched a lot of campaigns. I've seen a lot of better candidates lose because they didn't have the right message and they didn't do the job right. So that, I believe, is what we need to do. And again, I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon.